The Hollow Children. Chapter 1. The Village of Blackthorn. Nestled deep within the dense, foreboding forests of the English countryside lay the village of Blackthorn. It was a place forgotten by time, where the trees grew tall and twisted, and the air was perpetually thick with an eerie mist. The villagers were a superstitious lot, speaking in hushed tones of the old legends that surrounded their home. They warned of the Hollow Children, spectral beings said to roam the woods, luring the unwary to their doom. Eleanor had always been fascinated by the tales. As a child, she would sit by the fire, listening wide-eyed as her grandmother recounted the stories of the Hollow Children who had vanished centuries ago, their souls trapped in the forest, forever searching for a way to escape. But as she grew older, Eleanor dismissed the stories as mere folklore, the product of overactive imaginations. That was until she received the letter. Chapter 2. The Letter. The letter arrived on a cold, gray morning, the kind where the sky seemed to press down on the earth, suffocating it. The envelope was old, the paper brittle and yellowed, and the handwriting was spidery, almost illegible. It was from her uncle, a man she hadn't seen in years, inviting her to visit him in Blackthorn. Eleanor was hesitant. She had no fond memories of her uncle, and the thought of returning to the village filled her with a sense of unease. But curiosity got the better of her, and she packed her bags, determined to uncover the truth behind the legends. A part of her wondered if this was an opportunity to confront the fears that had quietly haunted her since childhood. Chapter 3. The Arrival. The journey to Blackthorn was long and arduous, the roads winding through the dense forest, the trees closing in around her like a living, breathing entity. By the time she arrived, the sun had set and the village was shrouded in darkness. Her uncle's house was a crumbling, Gothic structure on the edge of the village, its windows dark and lifeless. The air was thick, with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the wind carried with it the faint sound of whispers. Eleanor knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly, and stepped inside. The interior was cold and musty, the furniture covered in dust, the walls lined with old faded photographs. Some of the photos caught her eye children with hollow stares that seemed to follow her as she moved. She called out for her uncle, but there was no reply. The house was silent, save for the sound of her own breathing. Despite the silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Chapter 4. The Forest. The next morning, Eleanor decided to explore the village. The villagers were wary of her, their eyes filled with suspicion and fear. They spoke in hushed tones, their words barely audible, but she caught snippets of their conversations, whispers of the Hollow Children, of the forest, of the danger that lurked within. Eleanor ignored their warnings and ventured into the forest, determined to uncover the truth. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves, and the ground was soft and spongy beneath her feet. As she walked deeper into the forest, she began to feel a sense of unease. The trees seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing longer, the air growing colder. She could hear the faint sound of whispers, though she couldn't tell where they were coming from. At times, she thought she saw fleeting movements just beyond her line of sight, shadows slipping between the trees. And then, she saw them. Chapter 5. The Hollow Children. They were standing among the trees, their forms faint and translucent, their eyes hollow and empty. They were children, their faces pale and gaunt, their clothes tattered and worn. They stared at her, their expressions blank, and then they began to move towards her. Eleanor felt a chill run through her as the children approached, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. She wanted to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her body frozen in fear. The children surrounded her, their cold, ghostly hands reaching out to touch her. She could feel their presence, cold and malevolent, and she knew that they meant her harm. But within the fear, there was something else, faint, inexplicable familiarity, as if she had known them once, long ago. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the children were gone. The whispers faded away, and the forest was silent once more. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, overwhelmed by a wave of emotions she couldn't comprehend. Chapter 6. The Truth. Eleanor returned to the village, her mind racing with questions. She sought out the village elder, an old man named Thomas, who had lived in Blackthorn his entire life. Thomas told her the truth about the Hollow Children. Centuries ago, the village had been plagued by a terrible famine. The villagers, desperate and starving, had turned to dark rituals, sacrificing their children to the forest in the hope of appeasing the spirits. But the spirits were not appeased. The children's souls were trapped in the forest, their bodies hollowed out, their spirits forever searching for a way to escape. They were angry, restless, and they sought revenge on the descendants of those who had wronged them. Eleanor realized with a sinking feeling that she was one of those descendants. The familiar pull she had felt toward the forest wasn't just curiosity, it was a connection rooted deep in her bloodline. Chapter 7. The Ritual. Thomas told Eleanor that there was only one way to free the Hollow Children ritual that would release their souls from the forest. But the ritual was dangerous, and it required a sacrifice. Eleanor knew what she had to do. She returned to the forest, determined to perform the ritual and free the children's souls. A part of her felt this was her destiny, a debt she was meant to repay. The ritual was complex, requiring her to gather certain herbs and objects from the forest. As she worked, she could feel the presence of the Hollow Children, their whispers growing louder, more intense. Their faces seemed clearer now. Their eyes filled not just with anger, but with sorrow. Finally, she was ready. She stood in the center of a clearing, the objects arranged around her in a circle. She began to chant the words of the ritual, her voice trembling with fear. But as she continued, her fear transformed into determination. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the trees. The Hollow Children appeared, their forms faint and translucent, their eyes hollow and empty. Eleanor continued to chant, her voice growing stronger, more confident. The children began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air, their whispers growing fainter. And then, with a final deafening roar, the children were gone. Or so she thought. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. Eleanor returned to the village, exhausted but relieved. The Hollow Children were gone, their souls finally at peace. But as she walked through the village, she noticed something strange. The villagers were gone, their homes empty, their streets deserted. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Eleanor felt a chill run through her as she realized the truth. The Hollow Children had taken their revenge, their spirits finally free to claim the souls of those who had wronged them. But perhaps it wasn't just revenge. Perhaps the ritual had not freed them, but had bound them to a new cycle, with Eleanor as the catalyst. She was the only one left, or so she thought. Chapter 9. The Legacy. Eleanor left Blackthorn, never to return. The village became a ghost town, its streets empty, its homes crumbling into ruin. The forest reclaimed the land, the trees growing tall and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. But the legend of the Hollow Children lived on. Travelers who ventured too close to the forest would hear the faint sound of whispers, the cries of children lost in the darkness. And sometimes, on a cold, dark night, if you listened closely, you could hear them too. The whispers of the Hollow Children calling out to you, begging you to come back. But beware, for once you enter, you may never leave. Epilogue. Eleanor never spoke of what happened in Blackthorn. She moved to the city, far away from the forests and the legends, but she could never escape the memories. She still hears the whispers sometimes, in the dead of night. They call out to her, begging her to return, to join them in the forest, but she knows that she can never go back. The Hollow Children are a part of her now, a shadow that will follow her for the rest of her life. And she knows that one day, they will come for her. The end.